Another week in Silicon Valley and another week in Gen AI. Its last week was Dreamforce, and it was great to see many of you. And then this week, of course, it's TechCrunch Disrupt. And in a few weeks, the city will be the scene of TED AI in the Ferry building. That's the building that I work in. So I look forward to that event and seeing many of you. Now, this week, I have a very, very special guest that's going to help us make sense of this Gen AI mania that we keep hearing about, how you should think about it, what matters, what doesn't. We're going to cover all of that. But before we do that, there's a few resources I want to make sure you take a look at before you start your week. The first one is the research from the Boston Consulting Group. Just released some very interesting data on how CIO should focus their efforts on Gen AI, which use case to pick, how to pick them, and more importantly, the method they use to pick them is not a stack rank, something we talked about last week. It's a quadrant. So you're going to want to check that out. Very popular post on my LinkedIn, but also on my blog. My second resource, and I should say my second hero of the week, is Samir Jahik. Samir does a great job sharing great information about go-to-market, scale, and growth. And this week, he published some interesting research showing that 1 in 5 companies actually is not seeing AI improve their sales. And so the question is why? And as you'll see in the research, it's most likely because they're pointing AI in the wrong part of the workflow of their sales process. So there again, there's more in the blog and more in LinkedIn. Third, if you are wondering how Gen AI is going to impact cybersecurity, my friend Ben Lorica has a great podcast and a note for that for you, the future of cybersecurity, again, a resource I'm pointing you to in my blog. And of course, if you want a quick digest of what happened at Next and Dreamforce, what's new in Gen AI and data and analytics was published by my friend Jean Kutay. It's a panel we recorded live at the Salesforce Tower with Sanjeev and Ridhima. It's also on my LinkedIn profile and my blog. And then remember, this coming Friday, I will be debating Michael of CXO Talk on the topic of doing Gen AI in the enterprise. So send me your questions. You can DM me as always. But remember, you can watch it live and ask questions live. It's the third time I'm doing the CXO Talk show. Michael always does a great job. It's a really interesting formula. All right. Started the CarCast with this. Gen AI is just everywhere. It's in the press, of course, but it's in your apps. It's in your database. It's in your dashboard. It's on your phone. And if you're a tech and data leader, you're probably wondering, okay, how am I supposed to take advantage of this Gen AI trend, and lots of advice. And so to describe this topic, I've invited my good friend here, Tony Baer. Tony doesn't need much of an introduction. He is really an institution in the industry. Today is a principal at DB Insights. We met about 15 years ago when he was at Ovum. Tony just wrote a Gen AI trip report after traveling around the country. Probably should say around the world, talking to vendors and customers. So we're going to break that down today in a very simple manner so you can take action. So first of all, Tony, thank you for giving us the time to talk to us today.
Hey, Bruno, good to see you again.
Great to see you. All right, Tony, I listened to the podcast this past weekend, Screaming in the Cloud, that's done by Corey Quinn. And there you talked a bunch about databases. So I'm going to tell everyone, if they want to know about databases, they should go and listen to that podcast. We're not going to touch on databases here. But in the podcast, you start talking about topics that were interesting, like the data mesh and data fabric. These were super hot topics last year. And for some reason, they seem to have completely disappeared for the Gen AI trend. So do these things not matter anymore? What's up with this?
I guess Corey let me off easy on that one. This is basically a classic case of shiny new thing, and unless the shiny new thing is the same product as the shiny old thing, I think the thing that we tend to get confused about is that the shiny new thing replaces the shiny old thing. It's not the case. I mean, because data mesh and generative AI, we're really talking apples and oranges. Now, yes, data feeds into AI and generative AI, but that's really where the relationship goes. The issue that came up with data mesh, the way Jean-Marc basically framed it was new, but it really was an extension of a very old discussion. I mean, which is basically who owns the data. And that discussion goes all the way back, predates IT when we had hard copy and who had the key to that file cabinet. And so it's sort of perpetuated on the mainframe. I mean, in the early days, data was pretty limited on the mainframe, it was just financial data, so it's pretty clear cut. But when data got democratized, and you could say this started to happen with the PC, but where it really started to happen, I think, Bruno, you can relate to this because I mean, you came out of that industry, was in BI and analytics. Promise at that point was a dashboard on everybody's desktop to replace those static green screen reports. And so that really kind of sort of opened, kind of Pandora's box there. And I know you later on, you're going to talk about data quality. There are a lot of sort of issues that arose from that. And the issue, of course, it just complicated the whole question of who owns the data. Now, fast forward that to when we got to self-service visualization. So now you could basically handle this without calling in IT. And then coming up with the data lake, where all of a sudden all this data comes in, and and who owns it and what is it? And in many organizations, as those data lakes became data swamps, there's a lot of concern about really, as I said, the quality of that data. Can we have access to that data? Who's in charge in part of ownership is who's responsible for making sure that data is still current and valid. And also, what about all the pipelines? I mean, traditionally, it was kind of like we threw things over the wall. The business analyst, or the business had these requirements, and IT would execute it. And so that's really, I think, was with the data lake that it really kind of sparked all this. But the issue was always there under the surface. The difference this year is that, okay, last year it was the headline. When I looked at all my LinkedIn posts last year, I would sometimes get like 20,000 hits from just tagging data mesh. That's nothing compared to what I'm seeing this year with generative AI. But anyway, the issue has not gone away. I think really what we're coming into is now we're looking at the cold hard facts of what does this mean? How do we implement? And where does this fit? And the thing is, as I said, I understand the reason for data mesh. I think there's some instance, and there's some scenarios where it makes a lot of sense. Other scenarios where it doesn't. I mean, we can go to a whole separate discussion, but you've already aired that out with the ThoughtWorks folks on that, so I don't think we need to repeat that. But I think in answer to your question, the issue is still very much there, but I think it's just more under the surface now.
Yeah, and it sounds like what you're saying is that it wasn't new necessarily, but it's also not dead. To the benefit of GenAI, it's somewhat related, very similar to the issue of governance and data security. So when you look at the conversations you're having with your clients and vendors, how do people relate these two topics, particularly quality and security as it relates to GenAI? Where are people right now, and how should the people listening to us, how should they think about this? Which one's more important?
I don't think it's an either or. I mean, but the thing is that it's kind of like, answering the question, which one is your favorite child? You really can't. I mean, to get more trite here, this is kind of like forcing IT into like a Sophie's Choice here or something like that. And I'll give a good example of this, which is the cloud. And the typical question has been, how can you keep your data secure in the cloud? On the other hand, when you take a look at who is best equipped to really deal with with intrusions, is it going to be your IT department or a hyperscaler that deals with this because that's their core business? And so, on one hand, with the cloud, we actually do have there's expertise at scale there. Also with AI, with machine learning. I'm not even getting into generative. And maybe generative might play into this. I don't know. But with AI, basically, you can have like with machine learning, you can take a look. You can isolate those outliers. You can take you can get more predictive on the patterns and identify those patterns. So I think on one hand, the surface area is much bigger and more complex, and there are a lot of basically there are a lot of potholes that we could fall into. But on the other hand, we also have much better tools that at our at our disposal to deal with this.
It's interesting you're saying that, because in fact, what we've discovered talking to customers deploying at scale is that if you have terrible data quality, GenAI is actually going to amplify that. And you're going to discover that your data is really in bad shape. And in fact, we have seen customers who had deployed chatbots out into production and realized, because the poor quality, they actually turned that off and turn it around to help with data quality. So it's kind of maybe not a use case to think about it all the time, but maybe using GenAI to fix the metadata problem before you go into a customer-facing problem. Now, you've got a lot of information in this GenAI a trip report you wrote. There's one quote in it that I thought was particularly interesting as people go and check it out. You said GenAI will transform analytics, but it won't replace dashboards and visualizations. Now, I've heard vendors say that actually with this new trend, you won't need dashboards anymore. So can you expand on that? Why does it transform analytics? but why doesn't it replace the typical interface that we're used to for consuming analytics?
This gets down to the old saying of like, if all you have a hammer, everything's a nail.
Yeah,
And I mean, it really is. And the fact is that it's the same argument that, I was having a discussion actually at your next conference a few weeks back with someone who's basically sort of bemoaning the fact of when he was hearing from a lot of his clients, is that a lot of data scientists who work in machine learning were being there's been a pull to pull them into prompt engineering. And the thing is, I think there's kind of, and it's the same thing, it's kind of similar to the first question you were asking about, is generative replacing data mesh because it's the new hot topic. Generative AI is not going to replace machine learning, and it's also not going to replace dashboards. Dashboards, I mean, it's like the old thing of like a picture's worth 1,000 words. There are going to be times when we can use dashboards. There are going to be times when we can use visualizations. There are times when it would be nice to, act like Captain Kirk and speak to our computer, and our computer basically speaks back to us. And there are going to be times also with generative AI when we may want to perform certain tasks that obviously that's going to be well beyond that of a dashboard, which is like, let's do some summarization here. So we can basically summarize like our financial performance, our compliance, and also look for the needle in the haystack. So it's like, I think again, this really harkens back to the whole shiny new thing. And the fact is that it's the same sort of misconception that we thought that machine learning or chatbots were going to replace humans. There are a lot of times when a chatbot will be fine for routine questions, but a lot of times I want to speak to a person.
What I've learned about this industry is that when new technology comes in, there's always this perception that it's going to be replacement. I mean, this happened just about any trend I can think about, right? Hadoop replacing the data warehouse. And now, Gen AI replacing. But in fact, I think the reality is that it's an evolution. You started your example by talking about mainframe. We heard early on, oh, mainframes is over, they're going to be replaced, but they're still here. So I think a lot of what I'm learning is that it's not revolution, it's really an evolution. And it really is tied to the job to be done, just like you said, it's really about the use case, who is involved in that use case, and what's the most appropriate, most efficient technology to use. Now, you also said in your paper, Gen AI is not new because you referred to the work in transformer models. And typically people think, okay, well, the reason for why it's so hot now is because of ChatGPT really captured the collective imagination of consumers, really. But you have a great explanation in your paper of it's actually more than that. So can you explain what really is happening here beyond it's now a consumer example everybody can relate to?
Right. Well, first thing is I want to give credit to Google where Google is not it's credit to you folks, at Google, that Google's not even giving itself, which is that who came up with the transformer model? It was Google. And yet I've not heard a lot from you folks on that. And the fact is that's what made all this possible. So the first, I mean, just starting from scratch is that the transformer model, what it did is it provided a shortcut to all those neural networks, all these recurrent neural networks, which had to process everything in sequence. That transformer model said, something, let's take like a JPEG approach, to images, which is like, let's just focus on let's take a look at the whole thing and look at what's most important and focus the processing power there. So that's what started. So what's happening now? Okay, everybody's been excited about, become excited by ChatGPT. I mean, it's really, it's just taken over, basically the conversation, almost literally. But I think where the real action is going to be at the enterprise level is your models with your data. But when I say your models, in most cases, you are not going to develop that foundation model. You are not going to have the type of resources of, let's say, a Google or in the open source community or whatever. You're going to be choosing from a huge selection of foundation models that are good, and you're going to look for the one that's right for the purpose. So that itself could be a little, could be a little overwhelming. And I'm going to get a little meta at the moment, which is that as this field develops, I mean, I know like you folks, go with Model Guard, you have a selection of, about over 100 models. I'm sure that's going to be multiplied, exponentially within a year or two. I think we might want to use generative AI to help select the right, or foundation model to select the right foundation model. I mean, I could really see that happening.
I can see that.
The other thing also, though, and so right now, I see there's a lot of curiosity. There's certainly a lot of available use cases. I think what's happening right now, I think there are really two things. They both come under the heading of, and when I say English language is becoming the default API, it's English and whatever is the the popular speaking language. Just it's starting with English, but it's going to spread to many other world languages. Obviously, and I think and I think French should be up there.
Yeah.
Just,
Working on it.
but anyway, so the fact is that we're going to see English language or natural, or I'll say it's going conversational language, because we've had natural language query, which is more machine learning. Conversational query is really making it more natural, and that's becoming very big in any type of analytics. It's going to be big in how we work with enterprise applications. It's also going to be very big in terms of how we work with coding. What would you like this system to do? So that's going to be a very obvious one. But I think there are other use cases, such as I was talking before, like summarization. Basically collecting all those trails of breadcrumbs. It's really scaling human effort, and from that you start getting it. I mean, the use cases then just get only limited by the imagination. So I don't want to go off in the ether there. I don't. But the fact is, where I see this happening in the short term is that it's essentially it's conversational language as basically becoming the most popular API. I would think that's going to be the early trend. But in terms of what's actually going to be used at this point, I think right now this is new technology. So I mean, it's like I'm going to cite my friend Merv Adrian, fellow data gang member, who had a saying that said, like, in Silicon Valley, just because it's on a whiteboard must be reality. Well, the rest of the world is not Silicon Valley. So just because we're talking about it doesn't mean it's everyday reality. On the other hand, I'm going to leave you with, I'm going to conclude this with one example, which is that I was at actually an AWS conference back in the summer in New York, and they had a session just on generative AI for analysts, saying, "Hey, we're actually doing this. Everybody's been saying we're actually doing this," protesting their innocence. The next day, I had to show up to my physician for a routine appointment, and she actually had a transcription application. Now, medical transcription is not new. Well, this was generative, because what it is, it didn't just transcribe the words, it only just transcribed the important words. And so she did an experiment with me. First went through the exam, went through the results, and then segged into small talk on what are our vacation plans. And we went into that. And then she turned the screen around and showed me that generative program edited out the small talk. So it actually, so for as future as we say it's happening today.
That's pretty amazing. Now, in the podcast with Corey Quinn, you actually define, I thought that's where you were going to go, the poor experience at the medical office of having to fill out the same forms over and over. But the thing that I think is interesting here from a mindset standpoint, which I think is why it's so exciting too, is that for the last, as long as I remember working with machines, we've been focused on speaking machines language. And now it feels like we're turning it around where human language is driving the relationship with the machine. So we're entering a new era where the relationship with the machines is changing. Now, in your paper, you also talk about a key enablement technology, of course, the concept of vector databases. Now, this past weekend, I published this a great blog from Leonie Monigatti. She talks about how to explain what a vector database is to a 5-year-old. Now, people listening to us, they're not 5-year-old. They're actually very experienced data leaders. But still, I like the way you explain vector database in your paper. So can you give us kind of the TLDR on that? What are they? Why do they matter to the people listening to us?
Yeah. Vector data, I'm going to make this very short, which is vector, I mean, in regular data, in conventional databases, we have tabular data, which is, it's generally, text in most cases. But a vector database or vector data is really symbolic data. So it's converting that language, or it doesn't necessarily have to be language. It could be converting basically image into meanings. And again, this gets really, very esoteric. I don't want to get down into the weeds on this, but just think of it. It's like it's storing symbolic data. It requires a lot of heavy processing to convert that actual data, raw data, to symbolic data. But it's symbolic data. And what I would basically describe it as, it's really the fact table for a large language model. So in other words, with a large language model, instead of having to go through and do all that chunking and tokenization. It's like you have these these vectors, these symbolic, the storehouse of symbolic meanings stored. And so you can go straight to that as opposed to having to reinvent the wheel. So that, in short, that's how I would functionally define a vector database. That's not the technical definition. In terms of, are these a database? I see it as basically being very similar as graph, which is that for extreme circumstances, you will have a graph database. In most cases, it's a feature. It's a feature that gets added on to a relational database or gets added on to a document database. Basically, or white column database, what have you, relational or non-relational. I see it as basically being a feature. And also, and not only from the standpoint, I think it's too narrow market, it's also, I think there are going to be many use cases where you're going to want to basically converge tabular data. And here we're going back to those dashboards and visualizations with all the meanings. So you might have a conversational answer that also brings up a dashboard that shows you, the trend of sales in this particular region for last quarter.
And so you're kind of leading into the answer I think you might give me on my last question, which I think is around the convergence and simplification of all these various concepts. Because right now we see Gen AI everywhere, right? I started the conversation with that. They're embedded in your applications, primarily customer experience. They also talked a lot about as an assistant for productivity, business user productivity, to create content, but also developers' productivity. What should CIOs and chief data officers do here? How do they think about this? What should they get started with?
Well, one, don't think of it as a shiny new thing. Two, I'll add the trite little line that I used, or the trite or pithy little line that I used at the end of my report, which is trust but verify. Maybe it should be more distrust but verify. But the other thing also, obviously, this is new, and treat this as new technology. There is a script for that. Understand that the ultimate impact of this may be much wider than anything you've ever dealt with before. But on the other hand, it's a continuum, because we felt the same thing when we first got BI, when we first got self-service, and we got data lakes and all that sort of wonderful stuff. This is another example of where we're expanding the footprint, we're expanding the audience. So it's, from that standpoint, it's really not anything new from the standpoint of what we've been dealing with in IT for the last, any number of decades, at least the last 30 years. But the other thing also, there's one missing piece that I want to pay, that I think CIOs really do need to pay attention to. And it's the missing piece that I really saw in my travels, over the past 6 months, which is that we've been hearing a lot about what generative AI could do. And yes, we've heard lip service that, yes, of course, we're going to need to govern this.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think anybody has a clue on how to do this. Now, there's certain things that I see that constructive trends I see happening. I see, at least when we start dealing with your own, let's say models that are dealing with your own corpus of data, that it's going to be very important to cite the source. Cite where this data came from, from which you're putting together this answer, because otherwise, when you look at ChatGPT today, it's like you're asking a question to a high school senior who writes an essay, a short essay answer without any footnotes. Okay, yeah. Good luck with that. So no, citation is really important. But the other part also is that these models, by their very nature, are going to be black boxes. You're not going to know why a generative model or a large language model basically put this phrase together. It's going to be, because basically, think about it, generative models, they make computers sound sentient, but they're not. It's basically large language models are essentially huge probability models, like what word's going to go next, or what, or what's associated with this image. And it's a big probability problem, and doesn't lend itself to logical explanation. And so my sense there, and I don't have any, this is something which I'm going to be talking a lot more with folks like you and others in the industry about this, is how do we basically, validate this? And I think it's going to be a lot of empirical testing, a lot of empirical observation. I also think that maybe some generative adversarial networks, GANs, or basically where we have models compete against each other. And I would prefer put in a couple of models that are bad and test this out. And I think, I mean, look, this is going to be a long, figuring out how to govern this is going to be a long slog. So I think that, to me, is, I think, the biggest issue. I think the most important thing for, that say CIOs is keep your basically your ambitions and the problem bounded, keep the problem well defined, and keep the corpus of data, well bounded, and start with that, and then from there you're going to have to work with essentially the knowledge, or best practice, which are going to be a moving target.
It's interesting because, any content generation business, it's this key consideration of course, the provenance, traceability of that content, for, trustability, but also for the attribution. You didn't just create content out of air. Who does this original IP belong to, and so forth. So huge considerations around that, beyond the hype of, oh my gosh, I can interface with this with human language. There's a whole set of attribution, governance, ownership, trustability of the information that is huge consideration. People think about it on the enterprise side. I was talking to customers and how they think about it. Their interesting approach seems to be, the consensus, at least in the industry, is, at least in the way they assign budget, they're not replacing their Gen AI budget line for the AI budget line. They're really keeping them separate, because they're realizing that it's a completely different deal over here. It is,
Yes.
just like you said, it's not a net new thing. It really could potentially be transformational, but we have to make sure that we take care of the foundational work, so we don't lose track of the work that that matters for the organization. Now, you and I could talk forever here, and I look forward to getting feedback from the community, and people are going to your site and check out the trip report. If they want to follow you, where do they need to go?
Okay, well, first off, I'm up on LinkedIn. But the other thing also is that my generative AI trip report is available for free download at my website, DB Insight. It's dbinsight.io, and you'll see it straight on the homepage. You'll see a click, a link right there. It's in huge. We've made it very prominent. You just single click, just put your name and email, and that report is out to you, and that's all we care about.
That's outstanding. Well, I hope everybody goes to that page and downloads the report. I had a ton of fun reading it. So thanks for taking the time again, Tony. We will see you very, very soon.
Thanks, Bruno.